Climate Change Act and a recently politically agreed to EU regulation. And my research wasn't sort of looking at whether or not these laws are effective or how they're working, but how climate change law is progressing and how different ideas spread between jurisdictions and how jurisdictions influence each other when they're developing climate change laws. So today I'll give a brief overview of the political context in the UK, and then I'll talk a little bit about how the UK Climate Change Act works. Then I'll look at other European Union member states that have similar long-term climate change laws to the UK. Then I'll explain a bit about how the governance of the Energy Union and Climate Action Regulation works. And it's quite a mouthful, so I'll probably just refer to it as the GR from now on. And then I'll make some concluding remarks and we'll have time for any questions. So can everyone hear me all right? Is it clear and all good? Great. So firstly, I thought we'd just look at the political context in the UK. So I'm sure all of you are well aware of the 2006 Stern Review that was commissioned by the UK government, where Stern famously quantified inaction on climate change as the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. But this review also laid the foundations for the Climate Change Act. And you can see here I've got a timeline and there are 3 different governments throughout the last 10 years, and the Climate Change Act has stayed throughout those 3 governments. So the climate change consensus is held, and I think that's largely due to bipartisan political support from both the major parties in the UK for action on climate change. And although there are voices of dissent here and there, broadly speaking, there is bipartisan political support for climate change. So that's quite a contrast, as Jodie's sort of highlighted, in when we look at the Australian example in the last 10 years in Australia, where we've seen a lot of change in climate and energy policy. So now on to the UK Climate Change Act. So I'll go through 5 features, and those 5 features should help to explain how the Act works. So the first feature is a long-term binding GHG reduction target. So it's a scientifically informed target, and that's to reduce emissions by at least 80% on 1990 levels by 2050. And then there's a corresponding intermediate target, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26% by 2020. And so when I refer to emissions, the Climate Change Act encompasses all emissions that are identified by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I think the interesting thing to note about the long-term target is that it's economy-wide. So the Act doesn't stipulate that in agriculture, the UK government has to reduce emissions by X amount, or in transport, it needs to reduce X amount. It's sort of economy-wide. So it sort of creates this idea of a cost-effective path towards that greenhouse gas emission reduction. And there's a flexibility there, and the government can choose how it wants to reduce those emissions. So the next feature, the second feature, is called carbon budgets. And you'll see I've got a graph here, and you'll see that the carbon budgets are consecutive, so they follow each other. So the first budget was from 2008 to 2012. And the carbon budget sets a cap on the amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted within the budgetary period. And the level of the carbon budget needs to be set 12 years in advance. So I think that's a really important point to highlight, is the long-term planning that this law facilitates. And then government is required to present to Parliament policy proposals on how they'll stay within the carbon budget for that budgetary period. So those first 2 features, the long-term target and carbon budgets, they combine to produce this idea called policy backcasting, where decisions that are made today for the carbon budget that we're in need to be made with the long-term target in mind. I think that's quite an important feature of this type of legislation, that sort of certainty and that steady course towards a long-term transition, that these two features combine together to facilitate. So the fourth feature is quite a celebrated feature of the Climate Change Act, the independent advisory body called the Committee on Climate Change. And I've got a picture here of Lord Deben, also known as John Grummer, and he's a former Conservative MP and the current chair of the Climate Change Committee. He's quite a charismatic figure, apparently, and he's sort of, I sort of found preliminary evidence to suggest that him and his sort of enthusiasm for the Climate Change Act has led to an export of the UK Climate Change Act to other jurisdictions. So apparently he can walk into a room of Conservative politicians and walk out and they're convinced for action on climate change. But I think being a Conservative himself probably helps sell that message. So the Act, this body is required in legislation as part of the Climate Change Act, and it's required that this body is made up of experts in climate science. This body provides recommendations to government on what the level of the carbon budget should be so that it can maintain that 2050 target. And the government can also request that it undertakes bespoke analysis. So they've recently requested that they do some further research into the findings of the latest IPCC report. The advisory committee is meant to inoculate against political mood swings. So if a government is voted in that isn't so proactive on action on climate change, this independent advisory body is meant to be an external, additional check and balance on government performance in implementing the Act. The body is also required to present yearly progress reports to Parliament, and they're meant to inform Parliament if government is on track to meeting the carbon budget. Parliament is required to debate what the Climate Change Committee has presented to them, and government's also required to respond. So the next feature is adaptation planning. The Act mandates a 5-year cycle that begins with a comprehensive climate change risk assessment, and this is responded to with a national adaptation program which responds to the risks identified in the assessment. And the final feature is less of a feature perhaps and more of a principle, so the principle of accountability. So the Act doesn't have any sanctions in it, so there's no sort of recourse within the Act if the government doesn't reach its target. So it doesn't have to buy the equivalent of carbon credits on the ETS to reach the carbon budget. But it does rely on very extensive and detailed reporting to Parliament. So, for example, the government is required to provide Parliament with indicative annual ranges of where they predict that emissions will fall within each year of the carbon budget. The Secretary of State for the government department that's required to undertake the policy proposals in the 4th year of the budgetary period has to give a statement to Parliament explaining if they expect emissions to be within the budgetary period, and if not, need to explain why. So that there are quite extensive reporting provisions as the main accountability mechanism within the Act. And so I guess just to sum up now in the Climate Change Act, as Jodie said, it was hailed as groundbreaking when it was first passed through Parliament, and it's meant to chart a steady course towards a low carbon economy. And in my opinion, perhaps the most significant thing that it does is it places an obligation on the state to manage the transition to a low carbon economy. So a binding obligation on the state in law to be responsible. But interestingly, there's an NGO called Plan B in the UK that's currently taking the government to court, saying that the long-term target is outdated and that it needs to be more ambitious in order to be in line with Paris. and that it should actually be reformed to be net zero emissions by 2050. So that leads us quite nicely into our next slide, which is about other EU member states that have a very similar law to the UK law. So that's France, Norway, Finland, Ireland, and Sweden, with the Spain, Netherlands, and Germany currently underway in developing the law. And so both France and Sweden, for example, have a long-term target of net zero by 2050. And that's seen as being more in line with Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. It's interesting to note for a CCL audience, I think, that France actually has an economy-wide carbon tax within its long-term climate change law. So the pricing trajectory is 44 euro per tonne of CO2 in 2018, and it's to reach 100 euro by 2030. So now I come to the EU's latest offering in climate and energy law, and it's called the Governance of the Energy Union and Climate Action Regulation. So it's set to become law in December 2018. It's currently politically agreed to, and the text won't change. So I'll just mention a bit of background about how the EU came to have this regulation. So I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with the EU's 2020 targets. So the EU pledged to have a 20% reduction in carbon emissions from 1990 levels, to have 20% of final energy consumed to be from renewable sources, and 20% energy efficiency compared to projections. So in the 2020 targets, each member state had individual targets for their renewable energy contributions, and they were binding on each member state. However, when it came to formulating the 2030 targets, there was quite a lot of resistance from member states. They didn't want to have their own individual targets. They wanted to have an overarching EU-wide target. So then there was sort of this situation where I was like, well, how are we going to get here? What if each member state pledges what they think they can do renewable energy, and it doesn't add up to the whole EU-wide target? So that was sort of one of the driving factors behind the crafting of this regulation. How are we going to have a system of governance to ensure that we can reach this overarching EU-wide target when it comes to renewable energy? Another one of the driving factors behind it was that the European Union had a lot of overlapping legislation when it came to climate and energy, and they wanted that to be streamlined, and they wanted their internal reporting deadlines to be in line with the Paris Agreement. So all of that culminated in this regulation that we have, and the overall objective, the overarching objective of this regulation was to craft a fundamental transformation of Europe's energy system. So to try and create an internal energy market, an interconnected grid, so to have each of the member states connected, and to have that fueled by a low carbon energy supply. So that, I mean, if the EU can make that happen, that will mean a big reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector. So what are the member states required to do in this regulation? They're required to produce national action plans. So these are 10-year plans in which they have various targets they need to meet under 5 dimensions of the energy union. So those 5 dimensions are decarbonisation, energy efficiency, internal energy market, energy security, innovation, competitiveness and research. They are also required to produce 10-year national action plans, and these 10-year national, they're also required to produce long-term strategies with a 10-year perspective. So these long-term strategies are quite different to the Climate Change Act. So in the Climate Change Act, we saw this long-term target in law, this 2050 binding target, whereas the Governance of the Energy Union has long-term strategies instead. And there's a bit of a discussion in law about, do we need to move beyond targets? Do we need to move to something like a long-term strategy where government's required to think about the implication of the transition? So what will the implications be on society as large and the economy? So we see the idea of a just transition coming into the long-term strategies, where government has to come up with policy proposals to think about how and plan how society is going to adjust to a decarbonised economy. So that's a sort of a debate that's happening in the literature. Are targets enough, and do we need to go beyond targets, and what would that look like in the policy toolkit if we did? And perhaps these long-term strategies are an example of that. So the next point, and the last point I've got on this slide, is that the Commission is also required to produce a proposal for a long-term strategy. So it's important to note that this is just a proposal, and within the Commission's proposal, they're required to complete a comprehensive analysis. I think it's best to think about this analysis as divided into two components: an internal component, an internal EU component, and an external global component. So the internal component requires an analysis of various scenarios of how the EU will contribute towards its objectives under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So, you know, scenarios A, B, and C, how will it meet its commitments under Paris and the UNFCCC? And also, how will it meet net zero by 2050 and negative emissions thereafter? So it's not saying the EU will do this, but if it wanted to, what are its different scenarios and what are the different steps it could take in order to meet that? And then the external component requires the Commission to set out the implications. So if we took scenario A, B, or C, what would the implications of that be on the remaining global and union carbon budget? And I think this is really, really interesting that the EU is deciding to measure its own performance and what implications that performance will have on the remaining global carbon budget. And then I think it's even more interesting, perhaps, that the rationale for this provision is framed within the regulation as saying we want to do this so we can have to inform a discussion about cost efficiency, effectiveness, and fairness of greenhouse gas emission reductions. So I think it'll be quite interesting if the EU tries to sort of use this data in order to say, well, you know, we've reached our targets and this is what we see the implication of that being on the remaining global carbon budget. So this is a really interesting idea that's being introduced into law. So I guess just to sum up, there's sort of, I think, three main themes that I've seen as emerging in these two pieces of legislation, and I think that's a long-term perspective. So we saw that in the Climate Change Act with the long-term target, and here in the governance regulation with these long-term strategies. Both member states are required to produce them, and the Commission itself is thinking long-term. But then there's quite a big degree of flexibility. So in the Climate Change Act, the Act isn't saying how emissions need to be reduced, but just that they need to be reduced. And government has a great deal of flexibility in how to do that. It's true that the governance of the Energy Union is less flexible, I think, than the Climate Change Act. But I think that's because it's got a different objective. It's focusing on a fundamental transformation of the energy sector in the EU. And the last point, I think, to take away from these two pieces of legislation is that they both take an economy-wide approach. So it's quite a holistic approach to regulating climate change. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Anusha. See, and I'll bring everyone back in. That's really interesting. I think we're all jealous. Let me unmute everybody and then we can have some questions. Just a second. There we go. So everybody's unmuted. If you do happen to be in a particularly noisy space at the moment, then just unmute yourself while you're not talking. That'd be fantastic. Thank you. All right. Well, I just wonder if I could have the first question. And that is, I wonder if you could talk me more about the political circumstances as the context. You did mention that bipartisanship in the UK was what has led to, you know, sort of resilience of the legislation that took 10 years. and I suppose the question is about the EU as well. The EU is so diverse. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, of course, of course. So I think how the Climate Change Act arose is quite interesting. How did the stars align to get something like this passed through Parliament? So in 2005, the UK hosted the G8, and that sort of set the stage for the UK to sort of take leadership. And Tony Blair highlighted climate change as a really important international issue. And then as the Act was being passed through Parliament, Tony Blair was actually going to war in Iraq. And there was sort of this sense that the Climate Change Act might be a nice way to placate his more left-leaning supporters by passing through a piece of legislation. And then I guess another driving factor was that at the time, David Miliband was the Labor government's Environment Secretary, and he was sort of up-and-coming minister who was really keen to make his mark. And according to a interview that was conducted for a research piece, he was quite keen in convincing a reluctant Tony Blair to support the Act. And then lastly, I think the role of non-government organisations was really critical. So, for example, there was a Big Ask campaign, which was orchestrated by Friends of the Earth, and they collected 130,000 signatures in support of the bill. And Friends of the Earth were really instrumental in the drafting of the Act too. So it was quite a good sense of participation from civil society. And then I think you also asked about the EU. And I guess the EU is a very different political entity to the UK. And as you mentioned, Jodie, there are these different arms of the EU and different lawmaking bodies. So there are three: the Council of Ministers, the European Parliament and the European Commission. And each piece of legislation is debated between those three bodies. And I think something that was really fascinating throughout my research, I was conducting my research as the regulation was being finalised. It was finalised as my research was being written. And I sort of saw how the Act had evolved. So it started out very much as a regulation about energy, and you can see in the changes that the European Parliament were instrumental in sort of including climate targets within the Act. And so even to the point when the name of the regulation was changed. It used to just be Governance of the Energy Union, and now it's Governance of the Energy Union and Climate Action. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. I mean, I'll let everyone else ask questions as well, but of course another one is, you mentioned citizen engagement and how Friends of the Earth was involved in drafting the legislation. That's so interesting. It'll probably be something that someone else will ask as well though. So I'm going to ask everyone to just jump in with a question. Do you have one?
Peter Todd. I was wondering, Anusha, previously EU countries are both using carbon pricing and carbon trading. Under these new legislation changes, are those components still in place, or what? Do you know anything about how the EU's mechanisms have evolved?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I'm sort of part of my research, and sort of what my research was somewhat inspired by civil society organisations. And one of those was the European Climate Foundation, who you mentioned, Jodie, earlier. And they were quite heavily involved as a lobby group in the drafting of the Act. And a hole that they saw in European Union law was that the EU proclaims, and I think, in my opinion, is a climate change leader on the global stage. However, they only had targets up to 2030 in law. And that there was a situation where member states, as you saw in my slide, there's about 6 member states that have these long-term targets up to 2050, and the EU only had agreements up to 2030. And obviously, there are other regulations like the ETS that you mentioned, Peter, but I think a binding long-term target was missing. So I think this piece of legislation plugs a hole in that gap, but it doesn't replace existing EU law like the ETS. And there's also a RES, which is the Renewable Energy Directive, or someone might be able to correct me on the correct name of that, but there's the RES is the abbreviation. So this doesn't replace it, it just complements those two instruments. Does that answer your question, Peter?
Yes, thanks. That's good.
Before we have another question, Anusha, do you mind unsharing your screen, and then we'll be able to take up the screen with everyone. We can see everyone.
Sure.
No worries. Great. Thank you. I think that's how it works. Cover review. Any other questions? Who's next? Tom. Tom, were you in the UK at any time during all of this happening?
Well, I was. I was there for the last 5 months, but I didn't get too involved in things at that time. So what I can say, though, is that all of the people that I met in the UK seem to be turned on to doing something about climate change. They're keen, committed, and yeah, they don't seem to have a doubt that it's real and serious. Amongst the people I met, that very few people had any concerns, which differs markedly to Australia, I have to say.
Yeah, I'd agree, Tom. I think there's definitely a different tone to the political debate in the UK.
Interesting, isn't it? The way that the communications follows, innovative legislation. And I suppose Friends of the Earth, such a grassroots organisation, being involved in the drafting would have contributed to that. Is it the case that with the EU as well, having a grassroots or a civil society lobbying actually having been fundamental to the drafting of the legislation?
Yeah.
Could you say something about ongoing citizen sort of involvement? Is it something that it was a flash in the pan and now it's gone, or is it something that's ongoing?
Yeah, well, I think just to draw on that point, Jodie, so the long-term strategies that I mentioned, and member states are required to produce long-term strategies with a 30-year perspective. And the template for that's actually made it into the final text of the regulation was written by a civil society organisation. So that's another really interesting example of civil society input into the law. But also the European Union regulation requires a multi-level climate and energy dialogue. So this is a permanent stakeholder engagement dialogue where members of the public are invited to comment on the draft national plans and the draft 10-year strategies. The government has to report back, or the idea is that they have to report back on how they've included those comments. So there's very stringent provisions within this EU legislation on public participation. And how countries choose to enact that is another story, but at least it's there in the law, in my opinion anyway. And something that's actually missing from the UK Climate Change Act. There's no requirement within the law for the UK to talk to the public about what it's doing.
So, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Going back to that graph of the different 5-year plans, it looked like the EU was well on, the British government was well on track to meet its targets. Is that what the advisory committee is saying, or something different?
So I can pull up the graph again if we like.
Yep, that's okay.
That might be. So as you can see, we're currently in the third carbon budget. And the UK government has met the first carbon budget. They're on track to outperform in the second budget, as you can see there. However, they're not on track to meet the fourth carbon budget. And so you might have remembered I mentioned that the level of the carbon budget needs to be set 12 years in advance, and they project scenarios on how they're going to reach that carbon budget. And they're not on track to reach the fourth carbon budget. And that's actually an area where the Climate Change Act could be reformed. So I thought someone might ask a question on how the implementation of the Act's going. And some people are calling for, within the Act, an inclusion of a statutory respond time for the government to publish its carbon plan. So they've set the limit of the carbon budget for the fourth budgetary period. There was a long, long time delay before they said how they were going to get there and produce their plans. So part of the Independent Committee on Climate Change job is to advise the government as to whether or not their plans are good enough in order to reach the fourth carbon budget. Is that clear?
So even though we're only in the third budget, they're really giving advice as to whether we're on track to make the fourth. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yep, that's correct.
Wouldn't that be nice? I saw that you had a pie chart. Maybe that's what you're thinking of. I mean, in Australia, we know that Mark Butler and the ALP has a preference for sector by sector approach. And we have got no idea what a climate across the economy, climate legislation would look like next when we see it, really, except for legislation that already exists that hasn't really been given a chance. Yeah, so I suppose that's where the strategies come from a sector by sector analysis.
Yeah, exactly. So the current strategy that has been produced is called the Clean Growth Plan. And within the Clean Growth Plan, they have policies and proposals which speak to each of these areas of emissions that you can see. So they talk about improving energy productivity for business. So over here you can see business is 25% of emissions. They've got different policy responses in each of these areas.
Yep.
Yeah.
If no one has any further questions about this particular slide, we can take the screen share off and then just see if there's any final questions, and then we'll let you go. So Jim has a question, and Joyce.
Look, what I've heard about the Act is that there was a fairly broad consensus of support in Parliament, and we don't see that here, of course, or in the United States. And so the role of people like David Cameron and other senior Conservatives interests me, because obviously David Cameron went to the Arctic, and I can't imagine Scott Morrison going to the Pacific Islands to announce a climate policy. The symbolism of that, and I guess also the longevity of support, even though it's obviously waxed and waned from the Conservative side. I just wondered if you could comment on how critical that's been.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I could speak to the specifics, to be honest, other than the fact that the Act is still going, and that it has bipartisan political support. I think there was sort of was it Gordon Brown that introduced the green tax, and there was sort of huge outcry against that. So as you say, I think there are ebbs and flows in support. But the Act is still sort of seems to be implemented, and the government's trying to do something. I mean, it's questionable. In the first two carbon budgets, people say that the switch from coal to gas meant that a lot of those gains were already achieved. So I think the fourth and fifth carbon budget is where there'll really be a test of, are we willing to put our money where our mouth is and craft some really ambitious policies so we can stay within those carbon budgets.
Yeah, thanks, Anusha. That's been really interesting for us. And just the first thing I want to say is more of a comment that in Europe it does seem far more accepted there. I've been in Croatia and Austria, and there just doesn't seem to be the debate that occurs here. So we're quite unique, I think. But the question is, it seems that you had this confluence of kind of like politicians in the UK, like you mentioned Miliband, who kind of like just took that idea and ran with it. Is it good for maybe us as a group to try and find somebody like that who could just champion this? And I guess this is what we could be doing with our parliamentary friends try and find somebody who would kind of like look at what's happened in other jurisdictions and say, look, we can do this too. But how do we identify these people? And is there anyone out there that's a possibility?
Yeah, I think that would be great. But I think I think people on this call are probably much more well versed in who to target. I think having a long-term approach with a steady course to reach the long-term goal, but flexible at the same time, is one approach to the problem of climate change that sort of somehow tries to circumnavigate this idea that we have these really short-term election cycles, which somehow I think is a bit incompatible with action on climate change, because governments sometimes don't want to make expensive short-term decisions for somewhat unpredictable future changes into the Earth's physical system. So I think somehow the long-term design of these laws try to circumnavigate perhaps something that's difficult or a structural problem or issue that we have to deal with when we're trying to tackle climate change.
So I guess that creation of that external body, I can't remember the name of it, but an external body that kind of operates outside of those short election cycles was probably fairly critical. And it's you can't see where that would come from in our situation.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I guess did we not have one in the past that's been disbanded now? So it's a difficult one, but as you say, I think the Committee on Climate Change has been crucial in keeping the Act alive and keeping the law living and exporting the Act to other jurisdictions and keeping government accountable.
Yeah, tough.
Does someone know a bit more detail about Karen Phelps's first climate projects? Any Sydney-siders, for example, probably have a bit more detail about what she plans to do. And Sydney-siders who know what Karen Phelps has got in mind for week after next. Maybe that's she's got the capacity. She's got the capacity to actually go down that path. So
if you're coming on the 27th between 9:30 and 10:30.
Yeah.
So she's going to be speaking then.
Karen Phelps's maiden speech. That's right. That's what you mean.
Oh, the 26th is the maiden speech. You're coming with me to the maiden speech. So you.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, so Ingo there.
Yeah, Ingo's here.
Oh, hi.
Hi, hello.
Okay. Ingo, do you have a question for Anusha, and then we'll let her go?
Yeah, we haven't had a climate council, but I think what Joyce was referring to was the climate authority.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Various other organisations, and I think the first act of the Abbott government was to demolish some of those organisations. So if we could move back to having some of those independent statutory organisations helping to advise our government, it would be a great step, and I hope Karen's got that on her agenda.
Yes, I wonder. I'd say that might have been what I heard. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Anita. It's been wonderful to think about that. And are you going to go to the COP by any chance, or no? I mean, it's just over in Poland once you get back to the UK.
Yeah, no plans as yet, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Yes. Oh well, you can watch Australia not doing very much from just as easily from where you are.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Unfortunately. All right. Well, thank you once again. Everyone, stay on if you'd like. Just a quick briefing about things that are coming up in November. And before we do that, yeah, thanks, Anusha. Feel free to stay if you want, but I do know you've got other things.
Thanks very much. It was lovely to meet you all, and all the best. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for joining the call.
Yeah.
Bye. All right. Actually, there's only two things that have made the top of the list for November. The first one is just to let you know that there are some new carbon fee and dividend flyers and information that's about to come out because modelling is underway, and without saying very much about it, I can't tell you anything. But it is timely to get our resources lined up and ready to roll. And so just keep an eye out. I've attached links to folders on the G drive for where that material will be put. It'll be flyers, postcards, emphasising carbon fee and dividend, CCL obviously as the author of those documents, but carbon fee and dividend front and central, so that when we attend events at Parliament House in the next couple of weeks, and all around Australia, we'll be able to raise that awareness about what carbon fee and dividend is, what it even is. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'll just get out of, I'll share my screen and show you one of them. So we have got, you've seen this one before. Also, I've just unmuted everybody. And let's move it over. We've got, you've seen this that's promoting Citizens Climate Lobby with a few small changes. It can be used to promote carbon fee dividend, and that at the moment is what the draft looks like. Sorry, my screen shares all over the place. Just like that. And there's a few different images to choose from, thanks to Nell, who has a good collection of photos and knows how to put them together. So I'll just flick through and show you all of those different ones. So there's some choice, and we haven't chosen yet. Like that. And there's a lighthouse one and a road one. And on the back is a bit more information about what carbon fee and dividend is, how it works. So it look like that. The other thing that we could do is adjust our existing Citizens Climate Lobby Australia video to focus on the carbon fee and dividend, so that somebody can go in and watch a 1-minute description of what carbon fee and dividend is, which is essentially something that we've already got as part of the CCL Australia intro. So look out for those things coming through. So when we do our regular monthly communications with our local community groups and local government councillors and whoever we normally write to, certainly our federal MPs, then these things can be included as part of those communications once they're done. Secondly, letters to the editor on climate are on a roll because of all you guys writing letters. WA is, I don't think there's been a few days go past and there hasn't been, is that right? Yeah, so so with the extra, with the chance that there'll be a carbon fee and dividend possibly in the news in the next coming months, then even a very small mention of carbon fee dividend sort of joining into that momentum that you guys have already got going because of letters to the editors could be really good timing. And of course, probably everybody heard Craig Kelly just this week, bringing up he's apparently read the IPCC report. That was the first shocking news. And then the second shocking news was he latched onto the $150 lamb roast to put everyone back onto the back leg on carbon pricing. So if you haven't seen that, then look that up, and it opens up a great opportunity to continue the conversation and to correct him. So it just could mean that letters to the editor does pick up any mention of carbon pricing CFD, whereas before they might not have. And that's it, just those two things. Watch out for the flyers and postcards when Nell and I have worked on them and taken everybody's feedback and ideas. And letters to the editor to just look at how to mention carbon fee and dividend. And that's really it. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jodie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jodie.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bye. Karen Phelps, okay?
Yes, I'll see you there.
Okay, bye. Bye.
Feel free to stay on. I'm going to finish my cup of tea well.
Bye. Lovely to see you all.
Hey.
Bye-bye.
Jodie, I was going to say about those images that you just had up.
Yeah.
When I looked at it this morning, I think my first preference was the road one, where the road's kind of quite strong in the foreground. But just looking at it again, the leaf one on the left that you just had up was really good too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll show it up again if you want. Where is it? I don't think we have to choose. I've got a printer who's happy to do all of them if we want.
Okay, great. Well, that was my kind of actually my first preference, but I thought, how would that work out? But if it's possible, well, excellent, yeah.
Now, which road? So there's 2 or 3 different roads.
Yeah, the one where the road's quite strong in the foreground.
That one or that one?
Oh, I can't see any of them at the moment. It just says has started screen sharing at the moment, so it must be coming back.
Go back.
Oh, no.
Hang on. Sometimes
Anyway,
there's
I can... yeah, I think it's that one there on the bottom left now.
Okay.
There were 2 road ones. Oh, sorry, no. But they're both good. They're all good.
All right.
Yeah, the one I can see it now. The one that's actually right next to the leaf one.
Okay. Yeah. All right then. Yeah.
All good.
Yeah.
And I've written down what you said about the getting CF and D into the letters. I think that's what I'll pass that message on to Jane, and when she sends her next summary around, then she can include that.
Yeah, I mean, you guys will think of the right way to do it, and then we'll all learn from your success because it's a touchy one, isn't it? And we don't want to make Craig Kelly look too silly.
Don't we?
Yeah,
there is a fine line. Yeah, you've got to be respectful, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. It is hard though, isn't it? Because it is such a, he's obviously made some kind of mistake there. So
I hadn't seen it, so I'll go online now and have a look for that.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Jodie.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, good to see you.
See ya.
Yeah.